Welcome everybody to the second Beyond Brooks. Super excited for today. We're gonna have a great afternoon with Nate. I got to spend some time at his farm on Monday and it is just fantastic and beautiful. And he's probably one of the most interesting people I've met both in the wine industry as well as farming. So I'm super excited about today. I want to change up the tradition a little bit of our beginning, and I want to start with a toast. So if everybody would raise their glass of cider, what a toast does at the beginning of a virtual event is it gives you the right to start drinking. So you don't have to wait until we actually get to the tasting portion of the event. And so here's our toast: to continually live through the lens of others' passions and connect with the community and their craft. Let's go Beyond Brooks with Floreal Cider. Cheers. You may begin to drink. And having said that, I want to introduce Bree Stock. Many of you were on the last Beyond Brooks and have gotten to know her too. She's a master of wine and one of the most influential educators in the wine industry in general, but definitely in Oregon. She organizes, it's probably the second largest wine symposium in the country every year, and just does an amazing job. So she has a very important role in our industry, and I'm very lucky to be able to call her my friend and have her be our moderator for Beyond Brooks. So Bree, I'll let you take the stage.
Thanks, Janie, and cheers to everyone. Let's go Beyond Brooks with Floreal Cider. So as every production and package purchased of the Beyond Brooks packages, all proceeds go to support two important nonprofits. One that's a very new one, Wine Unify, is supporting education of trade in the wine industry for BIPOC trade professionals. And the other, which Janie has been a part of for a while now, is 1% for the Planet. And this organization is where 1% of all annual proceeds raised goes towards saving 1% for the planet. And Janie and the Brooks team's 1% for the Planet is Kiss the Ground, who we have coming up in April. We've got some exciting packages coming up with them for the Beyond Brooks. So stay tuned for that one, and thank you again for supporting this program, because it really does go to support social justice and environmental concerns. So cheers, everyone. Quick little housekeeping. So troubleshooting, if you're having any issues with your Wi-Fi or the screen getting a little paused, just hit the refresh button in your browser. It's that little semicircle with an arrow, and that should really correct everything, any of the technical issues. If there is another issue, you can put it into the chat, and there will be some troubleshooting chat that these guys will walk you through. How the chat and the Q&A work. So the chat is for you guys to talk to each other, give each other comments, high fives, say hi, let's meet in the lounge afterwards, etc. And then if you do have questions for Nate or for Janie or myself, please put the questions into the Q&A. And then if you are thinking the same question, like, oh, that's a great question, just hit the like button, and that will prompt the votes to go right up to the top for those important questions. So quick agenda and overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to lead off with a little bit about the Columbia Gorge, which is where we're spending our journey for this afternoon, which is where also Nate Reddy and his very unique farm and vineyard and cider company are. And then we will go into also tasting the wines and the story of how Brooks got to the gorge as well, and the vineyard that they work with in the gorge. And then, of course, we have, if you remember from last month, we do have the little lounge that we will all pop into. So Janie will have a lounge. Hers is the wine lounge, and Nate will have the cider lounge. And you can chat with me in the wine and cider lounge. I get the best of both worlds. There are web links to both of Brooks Wines and to Hi-U Wine Farm Floreal Cider on the screen as well. So click on any of those logos if during the conversation you feel the need to purchase. So let's, without any more ado, get into exploring Floreal Cider and the Columbia Gorge. So this is the magnificent Columbia River Gorge. Its beauty is immense and its diversity is immense also. So this is one of the great river valleys. It's one of the fourth largest river valleys in the US and has a huge amount of water traveling through it. It's also a very diverse growing region. It spans 80 miles from west to east and is located from the Willamette Valley and from Brooks about 100 miles northeast. So the Columbia River is the separating point between Oregon and Washington State, and that dividing line is really not so much of a dividing line when you're there, but for the states it's an important dividing line and is home to the nested American viticultural area of the Columbia Gorge AVA. So the diversity of this gorge is really in its topography and its climate. In the west, where it's close against the Pacific Ocean, it really feels the impact of all of the Pacific coastal storms that come in, and these massive coastal storms come into the western side of the Columbia River Gorge and dump up to 100 inches of rainfall a year, creating a very rich, dense topography full of Douglas firs. It's essentially a temperate rainforest and one of the last temperate rainforests on the planet. But if you head east, you start to dramatically drop in rainfall and increase in sunlight hours. And so with just over 80 miles heading towards the east, towards the Dalles, you really drop it from 100 inches of rainfall down to as little as 10 in the east. And it switches from temperate rainforest into grasslands and ponderosa pine. And you can see just a hint of that in this image right here as well. And also because of the steep walls of the Columbia River Gorge and the way that it's formed, there's an intense atmospheric pressure that's created by the Cascade mountain range and the steep walls of the gorge. And these atmospheric pressures create immense wind tunnel. And winds travel through this gorge at up to 35 miles an hour, which is intense for viticulture, but also quite handy for organic and biodynamic viticulture as well. And with this fascinating, diverse topography, it was all created millions of years ago. And we're going to now welcome Oregon's resident geologist, Dr. Scott Burns, to talk about how the gorge was formed.
About the gorge it's a story of two major floods. The first floods were from 14 to 16 million years ago. All of the basalt flows coming from eastern Oregon and filling up the area where the ancestral Columbia River was. One flow on top of another of basalt. So right over here we got Vista House, and that whole promontory there is one basalt flow. One basalt flow. The basalt flow came in and filled up totally from the bottom all the way to the top with one flow and solidified. And that is the flow that formed this particular headland.
Scott points out an intriguing difference between the two sides of the river.
The Oregon side is straight up and down. The Washington side is very, very low angle going up. Flow on top of flow on top of flow of the Columbia River basalt. But the whole thing has been uplifted and then tilted to the south. So the whole Washington side, the tilted side, is all landslide. The Oregon side has all the waterfalls because it's straight up and down. Water comes out to the edge and comes over. The other story that we have here are the Missoula Floods. Between 15 and 18,000 years ago, you had an ice dam that it formed up in northern Idaho. And then all of a sudden that dam broke. It took 3 days for all the water to leave, and then that came down through Spokane across eastern Washington. All that water got back into the Columbia River, and it came down the gorge.
Scott says these floods were the greatest known to have ever occurred in North America.
And we're talking velocities coming out of the gorge at 50 to 60 miles an hour, eroding things and big, huge boulders being bounced around on the bottom. We believe that there were 40 different floods that reached down here, and so they really had a significant effect on the gorge. And then way off in the distance, you could see Beacon Rock sticking up. And Beacon Rock is the heart of an old volcano. And the Missoula Floods have really scoured it away. And so we call it a volcanic plug or volcanic neck.
And why does that plug remain?
Because it is very, very dense basaltic andesite, and it just doesn't weather very rapidly. The other thing is it's very young, and it's the youngest volcano in the whole Portland area, 55,000 years old. And so those are some of the things that we can see.
I could listen to Scott Burns all day. He's just amazing ambassador for geology and for our region in general. So we now have a little map of the Columbia Gorge AVA on the screen. And this is one of the 4 cross-border AVAs that Oregon has. And this one is shared with Washington State. And so established in 2004, it's a reasonably small AVA at just over 1,300 acres with only 900 acres planted. And that's mostly on the Oregon side. The predominant soils, again, because of all of this volcanic and Missoula flood history, are quite diverse as well. So you have volcanic basalts, you have ash lahars, you have silt and sand sediments as well. So a real diversity of soils, which also means that you have a diversity of grape varieties that are suited to the area, combined with a diversity of elevations. So the Columbia Gorge really rises from sea level up to 1,400 feet plus elevation for growing conditions in the gorge. So lots of great varieties can be grown. And I'm going to invite Nate up to the stage now to really discuss about what he loves about the AVA. And hi, Nate, welcome to Beyond Brooks.
Hi,
You
good to see you.
have, I bet you have, you're like a kid in a candy shop, really, where you are in the gorge there. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of the gorge and really what drew you, what drew you to the area?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that we actually did not come to the gorge specifically for wine growing purposes. So we were looking for a farm, but just wanted to find a place that we enjoyed living. And coming to Oregon from Colorado, the gorge just felt more at home, just with the big mountains and rivers. And so that's the predominantly reason why we've been here. It took, when we first moved here, we absolutely did not understand what we were getting ourselves into. And so it's been this process of discovery. But the best way to sort of understand the gorge as a wine growing region is one that is sort of, it's kind of like the opposite of Burgundy or the Willamette. And so like in Burgundy, it's about these sort of subtle gradations from parcel to parcel. And so the overall sort of climate and feeling of the area in Burgundy or in the Willamette is relatively homogeneous. And then you have these very interesting small differences from piece to piece. And it's sort of exploring those nuances that sort of brings excitement to those wines and gives people pleasure and the whole thing. In the gorge is much more of like an epic terroir where you have massive differences from parcel to parcel and area to area. And so it's more about these, and it's really not about changes in geology. And so most of the gorge, it's all on basalt more or less. And there are differences in the topsoil, but even the topsoil, like it's a lot of, at higher elevations, you have a lot of, volcanic clay and ash that's quite old. And at lower elevations, it's a lot of silt, sand, loess that is either from the Missoula Floods or moved from lahars, like sort of more recent volcanic eruptions and those things. But you don't see like limestone and granite. It's not like Alsace where you have like, hundreds of different soil types. Instead, you have these really big differences in rainfall and really big differences in topography. And it creates niches where it's possible to grow any single grape variety that you could imagine. Mostly because there are the gradient of sort of rainfall sort of creates spots that are, you have places that are, and then also the volcanoes, right? You're in between these two cascade volcanoes, Mount Hood and Mount Adams. And so you also have this possibility of kind of always moving in elevation. So the difference in elevation, rainfall, creates places that in a 20-minute drive, you go from some of the coolest places to grow grapes to the warmest, but then you also have every single little niche in between. So there are places where you could grow Tempranillo that would resemble Rioja Alta. There are places that would resemble, growing a Sirtico in Santorini, or there are places that would feel like the Mosel. And so all those are possible, and you can get to them very quickly. And one of travel is difficult for a winemaker, right? And so if you normally, like in Europe, like if you're Raul Perez and you're in Galicia, which is for Europe, like a relatively diverse and also epic sort of wine growing region, you still might have to drive 2.5 hours to 3 hours to get from end to end. And in the Gorge, you can do the same thing in about a half an hour. Even the Willamette, going from, it's a long drive to go from the northern Willamette Valley down to Eugene and back to sample grapes in a day.
The Willamette Valley is a huge AVA. It's 3.5 million acres, and it's bigger than the length of Burgundy. From Paris to Macon. It's really it's quite large. So purchasing grapes in the Willamette from all over, which maybe is why there's so many estate vineyards in the Willamette Valley. But how do you decide what to work with? Are you just, your vineyard is, very much in that western cool region, right? So when you first purchased the vineyard, it was planted to the traditional, most planted varieties in the region, the Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, correct?
Correct.
And then what are you working with from other regions? And then what else have you planted? And what are the products that you're making from your farm there? And I can see your pig there, which is so adorable. And to see them snuffling around under the vines when you're having lunch in your tasting room is just amazing.
Yeah. So right now we farm 4 sites. And then we purchase grapes from a couple of other growers that share a similar sort of growing philosophy. We work with over 150 grape varieties that are mostly interplanted. And so prior to phylloxera in Europe, prior to Prohibition in North America, most vineyards were not, planted a single varietal, but they would have been sort of a collection of grape varieties that were interplanted based on what was traditional in an area. And we're sort of really inspired by permaculture and sort of natural farming, but in an increasing biodiversity and complexity. And so that was a way to sort of take that philosophy out into the vineyard, and to have as much sort of diversity of sort of vine material as possible, and sort of a way to increase complexity in a younger vineyard. But then the way we work with that is we definitely try to find, it's like 4 or 5 grape varieties that are sort of dominant in a blend, and then maybe another 10 to 15 that are sort of subordinate, that are the minority part of the blend. But we try to make a selection of grapes that ripen at roughly the same time. And that would have been from, it's mostly European vine species, right? It's vinifera, and so most of these had a historic home in Europe at a particular time. And so we try to find a collection of grape varieties from a spot in Europe that resembles the particular spot in the gorge that we're working with. And we've tried really hard to find sites that represent the whole climate range of the gorge. And so we make about 50 different wines, all from single parcels, all field blends that sort of reflect these different kind of eco niches in the gorge, in the pursuit of offering. It's sort of the idea is to capture as much information as possible. And so all of those sites are sort of reflecting a different sort of aspect of gorge. And then all those varieties are basically taking information from that site and sort of expressing it, in vinous form. And so we want to give people access, instead of exploring, in sort of extreme detail, a small point of information. We're interested in sort of making wines and offering a range of wines that show the extent of what's possible. And a lot of that comes from, I have more of a restaurant background. And in the restaurant, it was really about finding the right wine for your kind of your mood on a day and your emotions, but also for the season and like what food was being served. And so this way we're not limited in terms of the flavor profiles that are possible. And so there's not every wine we make will be for everyone, but we usually have a wine that will be exciting for the time of year, for the mood you're sort of feeling, and for what you like. The trick is just sort of sorting out which wine that is.
So really asking people to leave their, I guess, preconceptions at the door and be taken on a journey when you enter your tasting space with those wines.
Yeah, and the gorge is what makes it possible. Like otherwise, we could never do this like anywhere else. So there's sort of the opportunity that's there, and you sort of walk through that door when you're a grape grower here. And we're not alone. Like most of the other grape growers that I'm close friends with in the gorge are plant. They have all kinds of crazy things planted. So some Menthia and Trousseau and Analemma, and there's Ferment and Mondoux at Syncline, and Brian McCormick at Idiot's Grace has a bunch of crazy things planted. So it's like normal here. Like it's not.
So you're really only limited by what you can, what rootstocks or what plant material is available to get your hands on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And do you have the same philosophies with cider? How did I understand, coming from a background of fine dining restaurants and being, very captured by wine and wanting to explore that area. But, cider is something that is really only just starting to take off here. And so how did you approach cider, and what drew you to cider and apples? And tell me first about what drew you to it, and then also about your partnership with the Jacobson family, who has all these amazing orchards.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been drinking cider for a long time. And so about a little over 20 years ago, I was a sommelier at the French Laundry, and we used to serve cider as part of the tasting menu. Like it's, there's certain foods, like mussels with bourride, for instance, or moules frites, right? Like this is an amazing example, but a bunch of different like cheeses, pork in many different iterations. There's certain foods that for those foods, cider is the best thing to have. And we were aware of that back then. So it was something that, we always pursued and we're sort of tasting. So it's always been something I've been interested in. And when we started to make wine in the gorge, making cider is sort of an obvious thing. So this is in the Hood River where we are, it's a historic fruit growing region where apples, pears, cherries are very much part of the history and tradition, but no one was making cider. And so it seemed like a really obvious thing to do. We also saw like why people weren't doing it. And so we sort of jumped headlong into it, looking for a partner to collaborate with. And we ended up meeting, we were selling our produce from our little farm at the farmer's market. And we ended up meeting the Jacobson family, who have a biodynamic orchard at the base of the mountain. At the market, we tasted their apples and we're sort of just like, couldn't even believe they were apples. Like they tasted absolutely unlike, and I've tasted good apples. Like they're unlike anything I've ever had. They were so intense and complex. And they were offered, they had, 20 or 30 different varieties at the market. And as it turns out, they had over 100 different varieties planted. And so we sort of pursued this relationship with them to make cider.
And can you go into a little bit about that relationship? How, because you don't make cider with traditional apples that you eat, right? So how did you, start talking with them about, making cider and can you talk, your business model with them is very unique. So I think that's something that's really interesting and important that people should be aware of. So not only, how did you get into the business model and partnership with them and convince them to, graft their orchard over to cider apples?
Yeah, and so we were sort of looking at the Hood River Valley. And so in the 70s, about 4 families came from California to Hood River. One of the couples, the Hagees, is who we bought our property from. They were one of the first organic orchardists in the Hood River Valley, along with the Stewarts of Hood River Organics, and then along with the Jacobsons who had Mount Hood Organic Farm. And so they were some of the first people to bring organic and then biodynamic farming to the Hood River Valley. But the rest of it is conventionally farmed. And so you're in one of the most beautiful alpine river valleys in the entire world. But the farming's pretty problematic, so it's a lot of pesticides and a lot of fungicides and herbicides and not a lot of care for this extraordinary sort of growing place. And we looked at the relationship with the Jacobsons as a long-term, and a lot of the reason for that is that, like, people are really bothered by cosmetic flaws, right? And so paradoxically, the ugliest apples are going to be the apples that taste the best, right? And so the plant's reaction to stress and disease and kind of being open to that and not being totally coddled and protective is develop higher concentrations of both nutrients and of compounds that sort of give sort of more flavor to our food. But the market isn't designed to sort of reward that. And so for the growers in the valley, they, like, right now, there's not a great model for them to pursue like a different way of farming. And then in terms of cider's amazing because you put the product in inventory, right? And so now if you're a pear apple farmer, you've got a window to sell that fruit or you're going to lose it. And that puts you at significant sort of financial risk. And so a lot of our thoughts were, it's like, how can we make it easier for people to farm organically? How can we sort of model a more diversified sort of financial situation where they could grow some apples for market, some apples to make cider with, some apples to sell to cider producers and be successful. And the biggest impediment to that was that most cider producers won't pay very much for the apples, but the biggest thing was that the money from both wine and for the sale of apples is actually the sale of the bottle, not at the fruit sale. And so most growers don't make very much money. And so we wanted to trial a way of sort of getting the grower access to more of the profit side of the business. And so the way we set up the cider business was that they would provide the fruit. We would make the cider, and then we would split the rest of the costs and profits 50-50. So that way
it's shared risk.
It's shared risk, but also part shared creative. And so that shared risk, but also shared profits, but also they could be in part of the business that was more, more dynamic and exciting and could sort of learn how to do it, sort of guided by us who had more experience like in that area. And so that's the model. And the idea was it's a long-term project. So if over the course of 20 years, we can do something that is really compelling, both ecologically and financially on this basis, then other people can replicate it. And
that's really empowering for a community, for our community. I think that's, very empowering. And okay, now, I want to cheers to you on that because that's some big risk to do that and to work this way. But I also just want to actually start drinking some of this delicious cider and talking about the process. So, and I know Janie's the same. So I'm going to bring Janie up onto the stage and I want us to talk about this absolutely gorgeous beverage. Look at the color of this. I mean, it's almost, it's almost the color of the apples in the shot there, and it's just so vibrant and so deep and rich. And okay, my first question is, this looks more like cider that you purchase at a farmer's market. It doesn't look like the cider that I'm used to purchasing at the bar, or from New Seasons or something. That cider looks more like white wine. So why is it like this?
Yeah, and so the process for making the cider is, we want to make the cider more like we make wine. And so we age the apples after harvest for up to 30 days to sort of concentrate sugars and fruit, and then we mill the apples and then we macerate them like we would have like a macerated white wine. So the milled pulp we punch down once a day. We've done it as much as a month, but more typically for this cider, up to like 5 days. And then we load a vertical basket press, the same one we use for the white wines, and press directly in the barrel. And then the cider stays in barrel for a year, at which point it goes totally clear and finishes fermentation, goes dry, nothing is added. So there's no sulfur, no yeast, no enzymes, no anything like that. It's really untouched. And then when the cider begins fermenting in the next vintage, we use a portion of that cider, we add it to the previous years and bottle it. And then that creates a natural secondary fermentation in the bottle. And so the cloudiness here is basically the lees from that secondary fermentation. We could disgorge, if we disgorge, we could remove it. We're always a bit concerned about doing things, again, like just for cosmetic reasons. And so in this instance, like if we disgorge the cider, we sacrifice some of its freshness, some of its life, some of its for clearness. And for me, that always seems, it doesn't make a ton of sense. And so even if you think about champagne, right? Like when champagnes are on tirage, like when they're aging on the lees, they're more or less immortal. Like, so they do not oxidize, or they age and develop, but not in the way that we typically think about it. And so champagne's true bottle aging process, right, happens at disgorgement, when you've sort of removed. But if you just leave the cider on, or the sparkling wine, like we don't really see a difference in between how we approach wines or cider, like it's all fruit. But if you just leave it on those lees and you don't remove it, that plus the CO2, which is a preservative, means the cider is going to more or less age forever. And so that's something we find really exciting. Like one of the great joys of wine is throwing something in your cellar, forgetting about it, going back to it, when you think something should be past its prime, and being really surprised at what's developed. And so
you can do the same thing with the cider. You can put it in your cellar and let it evolve.
The cider, we've found that the apples are actually more resistant to oxidation than the wines. And so we don't have to top the cider, whereas the wine, it's not a floor thing. Like it just doesn't oxidize. And so it's just less, we found the cider to be altogether less fragile than the wine is. And certainly then when you add sort of being on the lees in the bottle, and then you add the CO2, they'll age forever.
And I mean, it's, when you smell this, it's so intense and so rich, and it's almost like fall in a glass. You get all of those typical, flavors that you think about at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, the baked apple and the honey and cinnamon and all of these, amazing baking spice flavors around that you sort of, shroud around apple pie and baked apple goods. And I mean, when you're tasting this, do you feel like you can taste the individual breeds of apples or varieties of apples that are in here? Are you choosing any of those specifically for this cider?
I mean, so this particular cider is based on the original apples that were on the property. So we planted a lot of trees in 2013 that were about 80 different new varieties, in addition to 100 varieties that were like already on the farm. So these are heirloom dessert apples and crab apples that were that are hot, particularly high sugar, high acid, and high and like highly aromatic. And it produces a cider that has higher than normal alcohol, because some of these apples can reach almost 20 bricks, so almost sort of wine levels, but the average is probably 17 or 18. You know, so the cider, you know, can push 10% alcohol. And then the acid is, you know, probably it's around 3.0 pH and acid between 9 and 12 grams, depending on the variety. So we're just looking for these dessert apples that they were growing, that were eating apples. It's basically so the modern apples that we eat in the grocery store, Fuji, Honeycrisp, those like sort of things are, I would call those eating apples, in that they're actually, what defines them is low concentration of everything. So they're not particularly sweet. They're around 14 bricks. The acid is low and they have no tannin. And so basically they're defined by being easy. Like they're like, what makes them eating apples is that you don't have to think about them very much. Heirloom dessert apples are totally different. And in dessert apples, literally, you used to harvest these in the fall, keep them in your root cellar, and pull these apples out for a special occasion at the end of a really special meal. And this was dessert before ice cream and all that like sort of like stuff. And they're way sweeter, but they don't taste as sweet because the acidity is higher. But they're also like wildly aromatic and complex. And so these are cultivars like Ashmead's Kernel, Golden Russet. The apple in this picture here is called Carmine de Soonneville, it's an apple from the Netherlands that is considered maybe one of the 5 greatest eating apples in the world. So there are all these lists of these extraordinary historic apples. Most people have never had them. And so these apples from the get served at they're like on the tasting menu at like Vespertine in Los Angeles. Like, it's like, you know, it's a very sort of exotic particular thing. But so this cider is not about what historic ciders were lower in alcohol, have more tannin, were often quite sweet. This is way more like a wine. It has higher sugar, higher acidity, and it's dry. We're now making other ciders that have more tannin, that sometimes have like color, like a red wine. So we have like some now capability to make rosé ciders. And then we're working with Perry pears. But when we've chosen our varieties, we've always chosen so basically like normally you think of cider as like this triangle, like sugar up here, acid, and then like tannin. And in a typical, normally in a typical cider, they try to find that balance at 5% alcohol. So relatively not that sweet, the apples, and then a balance between the acid and the tannin and that sort of sweetness. It's quite like a small triangle. What we're trying to do is build a triangle that's much bigger. So we've essentially selected apples that have more sugar, more acidity, and more tannin than normally exist. And so the future of our cider is actually, we'll continue to make Floreal. It's sort of what we've done. It's from the historic property, but the new ciders are basically intended to make a cider that's more intense than a wine. And we've done that by the cultivars that we've selected, and especially by using crab apples. And so crab apples are the most intense of all apples, and they can have sugars up to in excess of 30 bricks. They can have total acidities over 20, and a lot of tannin. And so by strategically using crab apples, you can basically blow what's possible kind of out of the box. And that's mostly what we're focused on, is actually developing that.
That's very cool. I lived in a orchard valley in Nova Scotia for a couple of years, and there were wild crab apples everywhere. And I thought they were just being young Australian who hadn't really been in many of these orchard areas. I just picked these apples thinking, oh, I can make fantastic, apple cider, apple juice, everything from them. Not so much. They are intensely acidic and hard. Yeah, the skin is so hard, and there's bitterness, and that's really cool. That I can't wait to taste some of those, some of those ciders coming from that. That's going to be amazing. We've got a couple of questions before we jump into Janie. What is the oldest bottle of cider that you have tasted, Nate?
Yeah, so it's actually one of my business partners, China. Her father had a biodynamic orchard in Vermont in the 70s where he made cider from their trees, and we have bottles actually from
the 70s.
That orchard. Yeah, totally incredible. And so those are the oldest ciders that I've had. Our first vintage was 14. And we're actually, so we make this other cider called Nevos that is all from crab apples. And we still haven't released the 14 Nevos. So it's been on tirage the whole time. We actually are going to disgorge that. It's bottled only in Magnum, but it's still a baby,
That's very cool. Okay, one other question. What are some great foods that you pair with ciders? I know you mentioned pork before, and that seems like a natural. But what are some other great foods that you pair with cider?
Yeah, sort of like thinking about, so all kinds of cheeses, right? Like, it's very typical that the places where you can, like, especially this kind of alpine cheeses, like these regions, so not these sort of like southern dried sheep's milk cheeses, but more these like cool climate,
Gooey.
French and like, yeah, like it will wash rind cheeses and that like sort of thing. Is sort of I think what's really exciting, and that you would often find in these alpine river valleys, cows sort of grazing, and that's a lot of them you see like transhumance and like that sort of thing related to sort of, cheese production is also the same kind of place where you see a lot of apples and pears like this growing. So that's a very natural pairing. It's incredible with shellfish. And so shellfish with sauces that are more based on, especially in butter and cream, are especially good. And then if you introduce a fruit component, that can be like wildly exciting. I mean, of all the things we make, the cider is actually the most flexible with food. So we often talk about Gruner Veltliners being like this, like where if you don't know what to like serve something, you pour Gruner Veltliner. And cider is pretty similar. So aside from dishes that are based on, I would tend to stray away from the more Mediterranean things, with cider. So heavily like sort of tomato-based sauces or eggplant or like things, maybe not like the best pairing, but whenever you have ingredients that from northern cold places, almost always amazing. But yeah, especially, amazing with charcuterie, amazing with shellfish, amazing, really incredible with pork. It's really like sort of classic. An amazing thing for Thanksgiving, right? Like great, like amazing. We've got like sort of all those dishes out on the table and the turkey and the stuffing and the whole thing. Like it's one of the things that's really incredible. And then the other thing to say about cider, right, is that even with our ciders, the alcohol is lower, right? So it's a great way to feel because you're not going to be like,
yeah, you can drink a bottle and still be okay.
Because the cider is not sweet. The two things cause a problem. So the sugar and or the alcohol can often just make it problematic to consume a certain quantity. This is really great because it's dry, so you don't get the buildup of the sugar, but it's also really low in alcohol. And so so especially in that period where you're just sort of socializing and like kind of drinking and hanging out, it's great because it's not going to make you feel bad in the same way that you know, if you got a wine at like 14%,
14%
a little bit hard after all.
Yeah. And I guess that actually comes into one of the questions that are up here as well, which is the meaning of bricks, which relates to alcohol levels in wine and
totally.
cider.
One of the, I mean, Bree should be answering this, right? I'm done. No, it's like, it's a common measurement for sugar, you know, for basically density of sugar in like a liquid. And so it's a way to talk about how many, it's a handy way to kind of potentially measure, you know, a liquid that has sugar and sort of talking about what's the density of that liquid and then convert that to grams per liter. And then from there to potential alcohol. So when the wine ferments, you're going to have, you know, alcohol and then, you know, CO2, these like sort of byproducts of like the fermentation. And so depending on how much sugar you had to start, that's going to determine your finished alcohol. So at, you know, 22 brick, it depends, different yeast convert sugar to alcohol at different rates. And so that's like, this is a really geeky thing that like a lot of people like sort of talk about. I was recently asked by Ken Palo, who's a really talented winemaker in the Willamette Hills. He started making cider with all the abandoned apples at Bethel Heights this year and at Justice. And he like asked me, he's like, Nate, like, what's the conversion, like for apple fermentations, what's the conversion from, you know, bricks to ethanol? Is it different from wine? So like with a wine, say 22 bricks, you're likely to get 13% alcohol. But that might not be true for every kind of fruit. Every kind of fermentation, yeast might behave differently in those different mediums. This is getting too complicated. Anyway.
And I will just say, actually, well, it is getting too complicated and geeky and people are going to start falling asleep, except for us. but when you Google bricks, it's not like the house bricks that you're building a house with. It's BRIX. So yeah, so Google BRIX and it will give you a concise, instead of us getting off on tangents of, what natural yeasts convert to and what I guess lab yeasts, manufactured yeasts can convert to as well.
It is important to like understand like how mind-bogglingly sweet some of these fruits that we're talking about get to. And so when you're talking about 22 bricks, you're almost 22 grams per liter sugar. It is it's really sweet. It's a lot of sugar. Like it's quite intense.
Yeah, it is mind-blowing once you start thinking about it in those terms of what we're actually drinking.
And there's another question up there, Nate, too, about because we suggested everybody go get pears and quince paste because we knew they wouldn't really be able to find the specialty apples. But can you just talk about all the components that are in the cider?
Yeah. So we use pear and quince in this cider, and again to increase complexity and capri. And if you've ever, I don't know if you have a quince with you or you've ever seen like a quince or you're related to it, they're incredibly aromatic. And so if you put a quince on your dining room table, it will make your whole house smell amazing until it starts to rot. But, and so we use the quince to enhance the aromatics. And quince doesn't yield very much. And so there's not like, if you ever try to, there's some edible quinces and some quinces that aren't edible. And it has really high pectin content. It has a lot of tannin. So there are two things that the quince is doing for the cider. It's enhancing the aromatics, but before we had a lot of true cider varieties that have tannin, the quince was actually what was providing tannin to our cider, which for cider, it increases, the tannins actually increase the viscosity of the cider. And they add, so especially when ciders are lower in alcohol, around 5%, the tannin actually helps give the cider texture that it's not getting from alcohol. So one of the things that alcohol conveys is viscosity. So it's what gives a wine sort of like weight and sometimes oiliness, like, you know, in your mouth, depending on like where it's at. And so cider at 5% is almost, there's so little alcohol as to almost make it taste like water, right? This does not taste like water. And part of that is that ours is not 5%, but also part of it is that tannins can replicate to a certain degree the textural change that you're getting from alcohol.
Yeah, and it kind of does feel like, it's quince season at the moment, and I was at my, CSA farmer stand, and I walked past a, bag of quince, and they're so aromatic. But then I picked it up, and it was kind of like velvet, the skin was like furry and velvety, and it kind of does line up with that kind of palate profile, the textural component. Yeah, that's really cool. Okay. Oh, what percentage of quince and what percentage of pear?
Yeah, it's up to 10% pear. The quince is probably 5%. It's not a huge part of it. And then it's about 20-ish other cultivars. We use as many as we can, but we only selecting high intensity things. And every year we started planting trees in 2013. So every year we get more trees. So we planted better varieties for Floreal in addition to varieties that sort of make these other cider styles possible.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question on here about were you influenced by Eric Bordelais?
Yeah, so when I talk about drinking early ciders, they were Bordelais ciders. And Maggie Harrison, who was my winemaking mentor, worked at Scenic Non as the assistant winemaker for a really long time, for about 8 years. And Bordelais was mentored by Didier Dagenot, and Manfred and Didier were really close. And there's definitely and Eric was a sommelier before doing the cider thing. And so they're definitely
parallels, yeah.
Some similarities. Say that the early Bordelais ciders were much wilder than current Bordelais ciders. He's grown bigger, and the production methods these days is relatively safe. And so Bordelais ciders are really impressive. The carbonation is basically introduced in tank, not in bottle. And so the characteristic, the bubbles, is not as sort of nuanced. And he's using a fair amount of sulfur and things. And so our styles are pretty different. And I definitely was more influenced, I would say, by very early Bordelais, and I'm talking 20 years ago, than sort of modern Bordelais, which is maybe a bit more commercial feeling, but but he was definitely the person that was doing it and kept it going before anybody else cared or was interested. And so he's a super important figure, and especially introducing sort of making cider part of the wine universe, which, sometimes you have intersections between beer, wine, and cider, and sometimes not. And he was definitely an instance of coming together.
Well, I think that's a great segue into how wine comes into the Columbia Gorge, and also how Brooks and Janie really ended up in the Columbia Gorge making wine as well, because we have, for our next wines that we're tasting, or that came in your pack, the Oak Ridge Vineyard Pinot Noir, and also the Oak Ridge Vineyard Gewürztraminer. And so, Janie, do you want to tell us a little background? And Nate, I know you still purchase grapes from both of these, from this vineyard as well. But, Janie, it's kind of rare that a winery in the Willamette Valley and an estate winery in the Willamette Valley would, how do you get to the gorge? It's 100 miles northeast of here.
There's two reasons really that we got to the gorge. Jimmy started making the Amicus white blend back in 1999, and it is modeled after an Alsace field blend. And so it has all the noble varietals in it of Alsace. It has Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, and Muscat. And trying to source Gewürztraminer for that wine has always been a challenge in the Willamette Valley, because there's not very much of it at all. And one of the things that we wanted to do over time was to actually break out and do bottlings of each of those varietals as well, because we always make the Amicus as an intentional blend. But we really wanted to be able to break out the components. So we kind of went on this mission to find new sources. And coupled with that, I happened to be in Tina's one night and had a bottle of the Dragonfly Gewürztraminer from Francis Tannehill. And it was a fabulous wine. And so that kind of sent me on this mission to try to find a source for Gewürztraminer in the gorge. And that's how I met Tom and Marlene Woodward, and they're actually on the event right now. So if anybody has questions for the farmers for these wonderful wines from Oak Ridge Vineyard, feel free to ask them in the chat. But I got on the phone with Marlene, and I ended up going up there and visiting the vineyard, and they made a beautiful lunch for me. And their passion as farmers is really what kind of struck me to say, I want to source fruit from this far away from our winery. We started with the Gewürztraminer. The vineyard was planted, the Gewürztraminer was planted back in 1984. Tom and Marlene have been farming it since 1995. It's certified organic, so it fell into a lot of the same objectives of what we want and what we want from our fruit. And then we've also been buying Pinot Noir from them as well.
And we are going to start tasting with the Pinot Noir, which is maybe a little off center, but this is how they taste in Burgundy. They taste Pinot Noir first, but more, I find the Gewürztraminer so intensely aromatic. And even though it's a dry wine, the richness and all of the acidity and everything in the Gewürztraminer tends to overshadow pretty much anything that comes after it. And Pinot Noir being such a delicate varietal, I really like to start tasting with Pinot Noir first. And it has, you know, soft tannins and very floral. So Janie, can you tell us about the block of Pinot Noir that you source from and the clone, and what you like about the differences of, you know, purchasing Pinot Noir from the gorge as opposed to the Eola Amity Hills, even though they're both, you know, basaltic soils?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's 100% Pommard is the block that we buy up there. And we, you know, we have Pommard on our estate vineyard too. And so when you try these two wines side by side, they are dramatically different. And so by having a new, you know, something else to offer in our portfolio, a lot of like what Nate was talking about, is you can make an extremely different wine from the Columbia Gorge than you can make from the Willamette Valley. The biggest differences for me really come down to the fruit and spice characteristics. You get a lot more kind of higher toned red fruits generally from Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley. When you taste this Columbia Gorge Pinot Noir and a lot of the wines from there, you know, this is at 1,400 feet elevation. It's south facing. It's much spicier, has a lot more earth characteristics to me than what you find typically in the Willamette Valley. So I love it for that reason. It's very different.
Yeah, there's almost more of a savoriness to it as well, and that sort of woodsy character instead of that really, yeah, like uplifted red pomegranate and red fruit aspect that you do get from, you know, the Jory and Nicaea soils in the Eola Amity Hills. Mm-hmm. And I love that it's Pommard, because Pommard, for me, I love that it does have that earthy, savory nature to it, as it's not just a fruit bomb Pinot Noir. And so for me, Pommard's probably one of my favorite clones. And I love that it's really only, I don't know, home in the Willamette Valley in the US. You know, it's really quite dominating here in the Willamette as well, and in Oregon, which is quite rare. Nate, do you want to also mention a little bit about the fruit that you source from Oak Ridge as well, and what you like about that fruit?
Yeah, for sure. We work, we have 1 acre block of Pinot Noir that they farm for us that is not far from where Janie's block is. And then they've also planted some Chardonnay for us on a bit lower on the site. And I think Anna Lemma started making a Chardonnay there from the 2014 vintage, so it was like wildly intense and exciting.
I remember that, yeah.
Inspired and excited to work with Chardonnay from the site. In general, like we make Pinot from 4 different sites in the gorge, including our farm. And And again, the gorge is so diverse, and so depending on where you're located and the elevation, you can produce almost any style of Pinot that's possible from their sites where you can make wines that are much more feel like they're more from the Sonoma coast. And then you can make wines that are more resemble the Willamette, and you can make wines that I think can be like quite Germanic actually. And similar to what you see in Northern Italy or in sort of like some of these other emergent places, in Germany. And so for me, the Oak Ridge Pinot is always the most delicate of the wines that we work with, and the most, you really feel the Alpine influence. And so it's on a ridge at 1,400 feet above the White Salmon River. And it's more, you're looking due south at Mount Hood, but you're really in this weather system that's more sort of dominated by weather kind of, from Mount Adams, which is, really like, really kind of wild, intense, place. And they're in a bit of like a kind of amazing banana belt where a lot of the sort of really intense weather systems sort of miss them. And so they're in this for whatever reason, that spot of the hill is like a really ideal, position, for growing grapes. But again, it was an Analemma wine that first helped me understand the site. So I think in 2011, I don't know if that's, but Thomas and really are gonna have to tell me if that's even possible or not true. I believe it was an 11 Oak Ridge Pinot that to me tasted like Lafarge Volnay. And it was this like very firm, extremely aromatic, pale colored Pinot. And then we were able to work with Pinot for the first time in 16 and had a sort of similar result where it was just extremely, it was like, the thing with like Volnay is it's like power that's like extremely subtle and these almost invisible, but like actually quite persistent tannins. And so for me, the wines have always been sneaky in that when you first taste them, the wine seems very light, and there's sort of an amazing delicacy to it, but the wines will often expand in volume and power over many days being open. And there's more intensity and sort of potential for longevity than it may seem when you're first in the glass. But.
Yeah, and I think that you see that in this wine as well. When I first opened it, it's very pale, but when it's in your palate, and after you've swallowed, it just persists for a really long time. And there's this really lovely core of, I don't want to say minerality, but there's this it's almost, like a very firm backbone. And there's really lovely, delicate, savory characters that are hanging off this very rigid spine. And so for me, yeah, it's really, really fine and intense. And so I think this wine is, really lovely to watch open up and yeah, like you say, taste it over a day or so, or, pour it into a decanter and let it expand. And I just love the aromatics and that structure on the palate. It's deceptive.
To me, this is the most exciting things about wine and wines that present like this, it's almost like it's almost orange, right? It's extremely pale.
Yeah.
And if you pay attention, they're the very persistent, super fine grained tannins on the finish. And it's, so the wine is weightless, but it is like quite cool.
Yeah, it's really
cool. I think all that I think we see that across a bunch of different producers' wines from the site, made in a bunch of different ways. It was like, it would clearly be a thing there.
Oh, looks like it was free.
Well.
So that is the 2017 Pinot Noir. Stays in barrel for 18 months, about 15 to 20% new oak. So not a lot of oak influence, consistent with the way Chris makes all of our wines. And let's follow that then with the Gewürztraminer. It's one of my favorites, right? It's got those amazing aromatics that you think you're going to get something sweet on the palate. And it's completely dry. Somebody just asked in the chat that the Gewürztraminer seems to be getting more the more it gets warm. We really prefer to have because they are much more expressive. And Bree's joining me. Come on, Bree.
Hi. My computer just is not charging, so
Well, come on in.
I'm going to sit on a bucket.
It's a good thing I'm in Oregon.
It is a good thing that you're in Oregon.
For this tasting. We were just talking about the Gewürztraminer.
Yeah, I love that. I love Gewürztraminer. It can be made in such a vast array of styles, right? But Nate, to your point earlier about the gorge not being Alsace, but I find that you can get such really age-worthy Gewürztraminer from the gorge, right? Really intense, like that elevation and the soil and concentration really brings out those spice characters. Super spicy.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like I was really involved in Italian wine and like bought wine in Italian restaurants. So we were really worked with a lot of wines from Alto Adige. So at the base of the wines made kind of in the base of the Dolomites in sort of these high elevation sites above these fruit growing valleys. And to me, Gewürztraminer from this site and the gorge in general is much more in common with sort of Alto Adige or like these Italian Gewürztraminers than from Alsace. So less oily, less botrytis inflected, so there's less of that like super exotic, less sugar and firmer backbones and more sort of like detailed, pretty mineral, but like precise, like less crazy colors, right? Like this is, it's relatively pale for Gewürz, which is a pink skin variety and can produce wines with botrytis that are, deep gold. And, this is, and I also think you don't get a lot of the sort of bitter notes that are more common, with Gewürz. So this kind of is, sort of sweet and fine versus more, aggressively bitter or whatnot.
Yeah, and you don't get that, that really intense soapy sort of.
Totally. Not in play like an
oily fatness that you can get from some Gewürztraminers. Besides, this feels like it's very concentrated to me, but it feels almost more like you're biting into, a nashi pear, one of those pear apple combinations, and that minerality again on the mid palate as well. That sort of that driving, firmness down the mid palate as well, which I don't know, just makes you want to have another sip of it as well once the acid relieves itself.
Yeah, no, and I think you're getting like physiological ripeness relative to those sugar levels in the site. So again, classically Gewürztraminer is like low acid, high alcohol, bitter, super oily, and this is sort of the opposite side of the spectrum, where it's more crystalline and precise and
super elegant. And Nate, since you're since you are a master sommelier, we're gonna hit you up for all the questions.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay. Yeah. You bowed out of that at a very good time. But I do love, the way that you work with food in your tasting room and on your property as well. And, can you talk a little bit about what you would pair with this kind of wine? And
yeah, really. Yeah, I think, it's flexible with a lot of different things, not just in a way that's dissimilar to the cider. But I think that with Gewürztraminer, you're always looking for dishes that have that little aromatic, extra, so things that like, for instance, feature saffron, like that can be like really, really exciting or interesting dishes that incorporate a fruit in sort of interesting ways. So like recently we've been talking about like basically enriching soup with like sort of like savory fruit jams, or if you can imagine like like tagines, where you're sort of doing braised meat with onions and spices and quince, that sort of thing. But I think to me, those are the big, and then like connecting the spice. So like Indian food could be really interesting if it's not, super, super spicy, but sort of more of like a sort of creative use of like, curries and like that sort of thing can be like really fun.
I love that idea of curry.
Like a fish with some vegetables and sort of a bit of like a curry thing, kind of going on, or like kind of, interesting rice dishes. I mean, a ton of things. I mean, Gewürztraminer is classically, it's one of the, things that can do a lot of extra things with food. And then you can use it with a lot of the sort of more, in the same way that you use muscat with asparagus, you can sort of play with some of those things with some of the sort of more interesting like green, foods, whether it be like asparagus or cardoons or pea shoots, or so you can sort of work to play off of the sort of green side of the variety, because there are those notes, as well. Like to me, Gewürztraminer are actually not that far.
Yeah.
You can have these like Szechuan peppercorn and these spice notes in Gewürz, and you can encounter similar things in Gruner. And so, you can try to connect up with the green side, connect up with the floral side, or connect with the spice side, and just being like intentional about, what's happening with those things.
Yeah, I love that.
And again, because the alcohol is not raging here, there are some pairings here that are possible with this wine, and because it's dry, right?
Yeah, dry is key.
Yeah, there's some like things that are possible with this. Someone just did a goat curry dish, and that's a super good idea. And I think as long as, and especially if it's more of like the curry doesn't have like it's often like lamb, like lamb with white wine is like really brilliant. Lamb with like white wine anchovies and that sort of thing. And so if you make that goat curry not as like caramelized, so if you cook the goat without browning it a lot, and like those sort of things, you can play more to the white wine in terms of more delicate presentation, but just sort of thinking about that kind of stuff is really important.
Yeah, someone suggested dark turkey meat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, Gewürz is one of these classic, classic Thanksgiving wine. So, it's such a bad flight, really, for you have a really delicate Pinot, and you've got Gewürz and some cider. Like, it's a pretty good Thanksgiving meal situation.
It's a perfect Thanksgiving table right there. And what I love about all of these is just they're all surprising, to me. And I kind of feel like, Nate, when you come and visit, your property and your tasting room, the wines that you're served and the whole experience is, so out of character and such a surprise, and just such a, departure from the classic, wine dialogue and tasting room dialogue. And it's kind of the same when you come to Janie's as well. You're in the Willamette Valley, and yes, they do a lot of Pinot Noir, but there's also all of these aromatic varieties and Riesling as well. And I just love that we've been so surprised by these wines, and it's really been just a nice, synergy that I just, maybe didn't know was there to begin with as well. So it's been a really fun journey.
Yeah, we're one of the two wineries to, there's all this change to Oregon land use law that allowed wineries to do more of the food in the tasting rooms. It's really possible for, and the two of us, along with like Cider, were some of the first wineries to sort of take advantage of, sort of those changes. And so there's this culture that is, food is more sort of built in,
right?
Yeah,
into the experience for sure.
Yeah, and it brings so much to the community. And it's funny because when I come to Janie's tasting room, I'm often seeing some of her growers sitting in the tasting room drinking a glass of wine as well. And it's kind of the same philosophy about the way that you've brought growers and producers in the gorge together and creating new products and different ideas and different businesses for them, and kind of the same with Janie here in the Eel Amity Hills as well. It's there's so many crossovers. It's great.
Yeah, totally.
Janie, now that we're together.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and we have spent pretty much taken up all of our time, which is amazing. I think it's been super interesting, Nate. It was so wonderful to come to your property and see it in person. So thank you for taking that time with Chris and I and Jillian on Monday.
Yeah.
It is incredible. If any of you do get to Oregon or you live in Oregon and you haven't made it out to Nate's place, obviously you can't go.
The closure, we're locked down now.
You can't go for the next 2 weeks. I mean, Nate and I were looking at each other on Monday like, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And sure enough, it's happened. But after 2 weeks, or once we're not in lockdown, I really encourage everyone to go out to Nate's property and have his tasting room experience. It's fabulous.
But book in advance.
Yes.
Both of these people are very popular.
All right, Nate. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking time during your busy Saturday, because I know this is one of your last days of service for a while.
Was last day, so.
Yeah, but it's been super special. And if you will stick around in the green room, and then we're going to open up the lounges. I just have a couple final messages, and then we're all going to go to the lounges. And Nate, you can pick the cider room. Katie, we probably should get rid of one of the lounges, maybe the cider and wine room, and Bree and I'll go to the wine room. And that way, if you guys have additional questions, we'll be around for a little bit longer. Sound good? All right. Thanks, Nate. So we just have a few more things. I know. I'll just scoot over. Gotta love this virtual stuff. So our next Beyond Brooks is with Rogue Creamery, where I am going tomorrow morning. Actually, I have a noon appointment there to meet with the owner, and I'm super excited to tour their property. That event is limited to 150 spots because of the limited supply of cheese that they have. So if you are interested and have not signed up, I suggest you do, because they actually blasted their email list this morning, and we've sold quite a few more tickets. But we're really looking forward to that. There is a rhyme and reason to when we scheduled each of these. It was purposeful that we had cider here in November. Really thinking about the Thanksgiving table in December. Obviously, we're probably not cheese. So when we have our holiday meals. So I welcome everybody to see that in December. And then I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you for your support of Beyond Brooks. I'm glad that we got to introduce you to Nate and Floreal Cider, and super excited to continue to introduce you to some of the greatest partners that we could find locally throughout Oregon and beyond. And we're really excited. So if everybody will join us, if you see the lounge button on the top, just press on that lounge and join, and either go to the cider room and spend a little bit of time with Nate, or come to the wine room and spend some time with Bree and I. And with that, we will see you next Beyond Brooks, December 12th.